Welcome back, listener. How are you doing? I'm glad you had a good week. My name is Aaron Richmond, and of course, you're listening to Aaron's Opinion, the podcast for blind people, where we talk about critical issues in the blindness community. Yeah, welcome back, everybody, on a very rainy Sunday night for me, wherever in the universe I am. And by the way, before we get going, always just have to say that this episode of Aaron's Opinion is copywritten by Aaron Richmond and Aaron's Opinion. Thank you. Aaron's Opinion can be heard almost anywhere you get a podcast, from Apple to Spotify to Spreaker, you name it, we're probably there. Follow us on Twitter, follow on Facebook, follow us on YouTube. Even consider becoming a patron on my Patreon. I would appreciate the support. And ladies and gentlemen, um, actually, I'm not going to name drop. I know you'd be fine with it out there at home. I know you'd be fine with it, but I'm just not going to. Um, and we both at home know why. It's a long story. But you at home, you asked me to include the blind history lady on Aaron's Opinion. Well, she's right here. How are you?
I'm doing just great.
So, one of the really interesting things that you said was that to reiterate what you do is that you just love history and you love writing about the, as you call it, our ancestors kind of in the blindness community from around the world. So I'm not terribly familiar with your writing, but you have a blog, you do a lot. Why don't you tell us what you do?
Well, actually, I never liked history. I never did well in school. And the history never appealed to me because it didn't say anything to me. It didn't tie me in. And I grew up in the blind community in Minnesota. My mother had gone to the North Dakota School for the Blind. I grew up knowing the piano tuners and the salesmen and the rug weavers and the blind guys who did the traditional, stereotypical blind job. And by the time I hit my late teens, early 20s, I must say I was embarrassed by them and felt they, how come they weren't trying harder? How come they didn't try to have a better life for themselves? And then several years later, I was given a task to clean out the old files in the NFB of Minnesota's offices as we were moving from a large building to small office space, comparatively small anyway. And we had to get rid of a whole bunch of junk. I was told that because I knew all the old timers, I would know what was important and what wasn't. I started to go through the files and read a little bit here, read a little bit there, throw a bunch of stuff out, which I totally regret to this very day now. But I started to read a letter from the 1920s, the early 1920s, because the National Federation of the Blind of Minnesota was actually before in the 1920s called the Minnesota Organization of the Blind. It was the mob. And I started to read this letter from one of our members talking about meeting with our blind congressman. And I thought I knew everything. Young people do. They know everything about everything. How come I did not know that Minnesota had a blind congressman, and who was he? They didn't even give his name in the letter. So I copied it, put it aside, and I started to pay more attention to the material I was looking at. And if it wasn't something that was going to be kept in the files and I thought it had something in it that was of importance, I'd put it aside, or I'd make a copy and put it aside. And I started to investigate who the blind senator was from Minnesota. I asked around. Nobody knew there was a blind senator from Minnesota. Everybody knew about Thomas Pryor Gore, the blind U.S. senator, but nobody knew about any blind congressman or senator from Minnesota. So I found out all about Thomas David Shaw, who was a blind congressman from Minnesota from 1914 to 1924, when he became the U.S. senator from Minnesota from 1925 till he was run down in 1935 by a hit-and-run driver that his family swears was hired by the mafia end of the DFL to kill him. And looking back, they may actually have some proof on their side. If today we were to investigate that crime, their family may have some legitimate reasons. So this all surprised me. And I just started to collect stories, magazine articles, books, and things like that. Then after many years of collecting all this stuff, my husband kind of said, this is kind of taking over the den. You either got to do something with this stuff or you have got to get rid of it. So I started to look at what I had. I had been writing, the little gossip columns and newsletters and things like that, articles in blindness magazines. But I started to pull a bunch of that together, and I wrote a couple of articles. One got published in the Iowa History Journal. But by this time, I was also getting involved in genealogy. I can't say I'm an expert genealogist, but I think I'm a little bit better than the average genealogist out there. I got involved in that in about 2000. And when I would get stumped on my family history, I would say, you know what, I wonder, and I would pull out one of the old news articles and take the genealogy approach to researching some of these blind people. And I have just been fascinated by what I call our blind ancestors. So I consider Thomas David Shaw to be the root of our family tree, if you will, for me anyway. And like I said, I became a genealogist. I've taken many genealogy classes, use a lot of the same tools that a genealogist would use. And as a blind person, I found it really easy to slide into some of those roles because so much if you're really going to go out there and do your family tree, if you're going to be a genealogist, people think, oh, you just go on ancestry.com and that's just the very beginning. One of the things that we learned is that you need to learn how to use people across the country and other genealogy clubs and organizations to help you go to the county courthouse because you don't want to travel there. It's too expensive to go and look for one piece of evidence, if you will. But how to use people to find what you're looking for. And I have taken that approach with several of the people that I research. I also have contacted the descendants of some of the people that I research. Many cases it's a distant niece or a distant nephew because not a lot of our blind ancestors got married and had children. They were strongly discouraged from doing that, either that their blindness may be hereditary or that a blind person wasn't capable of being a parent, that you really shouldn't do that. You needed somebody to take care of you, go marry a sighted person. There was even some of that in my own family, where, go find a nice sighted guy, go to college, get your MRS degree, These people have become very inspirational to me when I am looking at the times that they lived in and the obstacles they had to overcome, or that they tried things that today many blind people would be scared to try. And later on somebody would interview them and say, now, what made you think that as a blind person you could do that? And they would say, well, nobody told me I couldn't. And I find that to be kind of fascinating, the attitudes that some of these people have had and how, to me, inspirational it is. The struggles that they've had to go through and come out on top. The courage that they had did Did they all become rich and famous? Of course not. Otherwise, we would be hearing about them. But we have had famous blind people that history doesn't tell us about, such as Thomas David Shaw, who was in the U.S. Congress and then the U.S. Senate for 20 plus years. There's been other blind people that have been in Congress. We've had a blind man who was in Congress in the 1930s to 1940. That was the last time a blind person served in Congress. And when Thomas Pryor Gore left the Senate, that was the last time we had a blind U.S. senator. When I look at how many blind people ran for political office in 1880, 1890, 1900, 1920, 1950. And then about 1950, you start to see it drop down a little bit. By the 1970s, there's not that many blind people engaged in politics, serving in state legislatures. And today we don't have very many. Why is that? I think we could debate that back and forth many ways. Politics have definitely changed, and you need a lot of money behind you. Blind people just don't have those. Most blind people do not have those kinds of connections. So that is kind of why I got started, and why I keep doing it is because these people have, like I said, become my ancestors. We have a rich history. We should know that. We are constantly, as blind people, being told, no one's ever done that before. I don't know that you could do it. I don't know how a blind person could do that. If counselors, rehabilitation professionals, social workers were to take a course on what disabled people have done in the past, not look at the types of medical conditions that we have, or whether or not we learned Braille at age 4 or 7 or what have you, but what happened after you left the school for the blind? What happened after you left the rehabilitation program? What did you do? What did you accomplish? We have a rich history, but we don't teach it to anybody. The teachers of the blind, they don't teach it. They don't encourage blind children to reach for the stars because they don't know of anybody that's done something out of the ordinary before. And what if we had teachers who knew that blind people have been presidents of banks, that blind people have invented cruise control, that blind people have invented the window that comes in for easy cleaning? What a difference that might make in a child's life to be something like that.
You know, let me just plug in. It was perfect timing. My microphone is telling me that it would like to be plugged in. And then I have a lot of things to say. Hold on.
Okay.
First thing I have to say is, number one, history is my favorite topic. I'm a teacher. I work online teaching English as a second language to students who live all over the world. I work for Company X. That's what I call the company, let's say.
Okay.
And as a teacher and as someone who loves history, all I can say is from the bottom of my heart, amen. I completely support you in research, doing all of this research and compiling all of this information to educate the world about this. Because until you said that name of those people, the Thomas David Shaw and these people, I had never heard of these people before. And I'm a young person. I'm a young guy. I'm 29 years old. I have never heard of that person in my life. And I'm so glad that I have. So glad that you came in today just to tell that story because it's so important. And I think it really, one of the most interesting points that you've made about this whole thing that really is a real slap in the face. And it should be a